Hello, my friends. D.L. Anderson here. Welcome back to Transformation by Truth podcast as we share the truth concerning these last days and what you must do to save yourself from the violent times that are just ahead. Today's podcast is a word of truth accounting of the end times. The end is coming. The end is near. Today's podcast is entitled End Times 391, Reigning Over Disobedience and Doubt, Part 1. The Armed Guard and Watchman of Obedience, another key to achieving mind regulation. The podcast objectives are analyze the primary illustrations of obedience, reveal the purpose of the whole armor of Elohim, and analyze the role of truth in transformation. This lesson contains timelines and other visuals. Therefore, if you are listening to the podcast, I advise you to watch the video version on our website or YouTube, or request a PDF of the lesson so you can add the visual effect. The primary illustration of obedience. Shalom, my beloved brothers and sisters, and welcome to day 173 of our exposition of lawlessness. In the most recent podcast, we analyze the importance of reigning over disobedience and its association with the prior reign we have established over doubt. Along these lines, the key to reigning over disobedience is, quite simply, being obedient in all things. And this starts with you unlocking the power of compliance, conformance, and transformation vis-a-vis their primary illustrations in your quest. In doing so, you, my friend, will finally be able to unlock the primary illustration of obedience. It is a complex function, which is not only one of the most crucial in your quest, but it is also manifested into primary illustrations. Enter an armed guard and a watchman. Now, it goes without saying that the primary illustration of obedience is aligned with the primary objective of obedience, which per precedence is established squarely upon the primary objective of transformation, i.e., its critical degree. Along these lines, the primary objectives of all the degrees of holiness are sequential. You can see this by observing the table below. It begins with compliance, which causes us to fall in line with all the standards of holiness, which leads to conformance, which causes us to follow every rule of holiness, which leads to transformation, which helps us change our minds by purging our thought dimensions of anything contrary to the Father's will, which leads to obedience, which causes us to follow the Father's will wherever it leads us, regardless of the outcome. Along these lines, the final critical phase in unlocking the power of obedience is changing your mind by purging your thought dimension of anything contrary to the Father's will. And as this is the primary objective of transformation, this purging is something you must do every day. Now, as you would expect, the purging of your thought dimension is executed by the primary illustration of obedience, to wit, the armed guard and watchman. The watchman operating in the similitude of a coach, which we analyzed in a prior podcast. Now, the question we should chiefly entertain is, Why do we wait this long to unlock the armed guard and watchman of obedience? He obviously provides an amazing level of security within our minds. Why can't we access these features earlier in our quest? The answer is sure, and it is found by analyzing the relationship between obedience and faith. Along these lines, we have already established how obedience is the primary application and affliction of faith. Vis-a-vis, our faith in an authority figure is the source of our obedience to that authority figure. Ergo, where there is no faith, there can be no obedience. Not only this, but you must remember the primary illustration and work of faith. To wit, the primary illustration of faith is a fence. And per the table below, the primary work of faith is to guard and stabilize our minds by regulating our thoughts per the standards of truth. This speaks to the spiritual model of mind regulation, which we covered in End Times 351, Maintaining Your Victory Over Doubt, Part 1, which was posted on October 9th, 2024. In that podcast, we came to see how the fence of faith is designed to initiate the process by which we achieve mind regulation. By definition, mind regulation is the process by which we routinely filter harmful thoughts out of our minds while reserving space for spiritual thoughts that will enhance our meditations and lighten our path. Along these lines, our fence of faith is a thought shield that prevents harmful thoughts from entering our minds. And in doing so, it creates a regulated environment that is so organized, it becomes very easy for you to detect thoughts that are contrary to the Father's will. This is where your armed guard and watchman come into play. He is there to deal with those thoughts that are contrary to the Father's will. And this, my friends, is why we need the fence of faith in place before we can unlock the armed guard and watchman of obedience. My dear friends, you must believe me. If you have not established your fence of faith and achieved a focal point of mind regulation, your armed guard and watchman will not be effective. Vis-a-vis, your watchman could not zero in on harmful thoughts because there would be too many harmful thoughts for him to zero in on. And thus, your armed guard could not deal with these thoughts because there would be too many to deal with. And this, my friends, is yet another witness to the line upon line, precept upon precept, linear model of holiness. Buy the truth and sell it not. Now, I said a lot in that first section, and so I'm not going to introduce a new line of thought in this podcast. Rather, I'm going to summarize the truth shared in the first section to ensure you understand the role of obedience in achieving mind regulation. Okay, so first things first, the primary illustration of obedience is an armed guard and watchman. Here again, these features are designed to complete the process of mind regulation, a procedure that was initiated with your attainment of faith. In this example, faith is a fence which drastically slows down the steady procession of thoughts into our minds. This makes our thoughts much easier to account for and consequently much easier to manage. Nonetheless, we came to a critical conclusion as it pertains to faith. Vis-a-vis, faith does not operate outside of the primary function of a fence. Therefore, faith alone is unable to transform the thought dimension because it does not address the thoughts which remain in our minds. For better, our fence of faith is designed to keep a good portions of thoughts, evil and or indifferent, out of our minds. Now, this is where obedience comes onto the scene, vis-a-vis its role as a watchman. To wit, obedience watches over our minds to determine the spiritual nature and value of each thought that penetrates our fence of faith. You could look at him as an intense investigator, thoroughly examining and questioning each thought that enters and resides within our minds. And as you would expect, those thoughts align with the Father's vision for your life will remain. Now, what do you think he will do with those thoughts which are not aligned with the Father's will? You guessed it. He will subdue them and cast them out of your mind. For this is what any faithful guard would do to a trespasser. 2 Corinthians 10:4-6 is revealing. For the weapons we fight with are not carnal, but mighty in Elohim, for overthrowing strongholds, casting down imaginations, and every high matter that exalts itself against the knowledge of Elohim, taking captive every thought to make it obedient to the Mashiach, and being ready to punish all disobedience when your obedience is complete. Brothers and sisters, this may be the most powerful passage of Scripture as it pertains to the transformative work of obedience and faith in our minds. Listen to what Shaul is revealing. First and foremost, he reveals the purpose of the whole armor of Elohim, that is, for overthrowing strongholds. And what do we know about strongholds? Vis-a-vis, every stronghold is a derivative of the 80 degrees of lawlessness. Ergo, the whole armor of Elohim is designed to defeat the 80 degrees of lawlessness. That is its purpose. Now, I am quite sure this comes as no surprise to those of you who have been with us from the beginning of this series on lawlessness, but it is something you must never forget. Listen to me. We're not here to simply share knowledge about the 80 degrees of lawlessness. Quite the contrary. We are here to show you how to use the whole armor of Elohim to overthrow every stronghold the enemy has formed in your life. Why? It's because these strongholds will prevent you from obtaining the seal of Elohim. And ultimately, it will prevent you from having everlasting life. To that end, the knowledge we are sharing concerning the 80 degrees of lawlessness has immense value because A, it will allow you to easily recognize these strongholds, and B, it will give you a blueprint for eliminating each one, once and for all and forever. Not only this, but Shaul is revealing that our spiritual arsenal is for casting down imaginations and every high matter that exalts itself against the knowledge of Elohim. Plainly speaking, it is to identify every thought that is contrary to the will of Elohim and to cast it out of our minds. Here again, this is the role of obedience in your quest. This is the singular function of your armed guard and watchman. As Shaul is revealing, the armed guard and watchman is designed to take captive every thought within your mind and to make it obedient to the spiritual model of Yahushua Messiah. Now, needless to say, the constant confinement and removal of contrary thoughts from the mind is the source of its transformation. For it is impossible to be transformed apart from transformative thoughts deriving from a source of truth. Here is why. The transformation process is highlighted by a persistent parallel acquisition of truth, i.e., a spiritual factor which is the source of the transformation of our thought dimension. In this example, truth is the nourishment of the armed guard and watchman of obedience. And if you want to have a successful quest, you must ensure that this leading hero is well nourished with as much truth as possible. Thus, I encourage all to buy the truth and sell it not, and he will keep a perfect watch. Now, here is the final word. The key to reigning over disobedience and doubt is subduing evil thoughts and throwing them out. Brothers and sisters, this is not rocket science, and we have touched on this often before. To wit, if you have evil thoughts, you will develop evil intentions. And if you have evil intentions, you will commit evil actions. You will transact one of the 80 degrees of lawlessness. Notwithstanding, there is a simple way to avoid this transaction altogether, and it begins with transforming the landscape of your thought dimension by constantly purging out every evil thought. True, this is easier said than done, and yet it must be done, or you will not only lose your war with disobedience and doubt, my dear friend, you will lose every war you fight with lawlessness. Therefore, understanding the times we are living in, this is a crucial matter we must get right. We must unlock the power of obedience to achieve the second half of mind regulation. And then we must continue to fight. Now, here is today's assignment. Meditate on all the lessons you have heard this week and ask the Father to give you clarity on anything you are struggling to receive. And if you are led, please feel free to reach out to me. You can fill out a form on our website and let us know what questions you have. And remember, the only question that can truly hurt you is the one you fail to ask. Last but not least, enjoy the upcoming Shabbat and the weekend, and be ready to get back at it next week as we continue to make our calling and election sure in pursuit of the precious and priceless seal of Elohim. Now, here is what's next. We completed today's podcast, End Times 391, Reigning Over Disobedience and Doubt, Part 1. And the next podcast is entitled End Times 392, Reigning Over Disobedience and Doubt, Part 2. I will post this podcast on Monday, December 23rd, 2024. Until then, my friends, continue to be led by the Spirit of Elohim Continue to watch, continue to pray, continue in fasting, and most of all, continue to be focused, for the end is coming. The end is near.